There is a feeling that most people never admit out loud, and maybe you've never admitted it either. Someone sends you a message, "We're stopping by on Friday." You read it, smile, and reply, "Of course, I'd love to see you." But something inside you tightens, not because you dislike those people, not because you don't care about them. The strange thing is that the exhaustion arrives before anyone has even stepped through your door. Most people assume that not enjoying guests means you're unfriendly, antisocial, or simply bad with people. But psychology and neuroscience suggest something very different. And by the end of this conversation, you may discover that what you've been calling a weakness is actually a completely different kind of strength. Because this isn't really about guests, it's about what happens inside your mind when your personal space suddenly becomes a social space. It's about why some people recover energy through company, while others recover it through silence. And it's about 4 traits that often appear together, shaping the way a person thinks, feels, and experiences the world. The first one is far more important than most people realize, and it begins with something your brain considers a place of safety. Your home is not just a building. It is not just walls, furniture, or a place where you sleep. For your nervous system, it serves a much deeper purpose. It is the environment where vigilance can finally relax. The place where your mind stops scanning every expression, every tone of voice, every subtle shift in the atmosphere. And most people never think about this. They assume that feeling comfortable at home is simply a preference. But your brain treats it as something much more important, a protected space, a place where mental resources can recover. And that is exactly why the arrival of guests can feel surprisingly exhausting. The moment other people enter your environment, your attention begins to expand. You notice things you weren't paying attention to a moment ago. Facial expressions, changes in tone, moments of silence, small emotional signals that most people completely miss. And you do this automatically, not because you're trying to analyze everyone, not because you're anxious, but because your mind naturally processes more information than average. Some people can sit in a crowded room and notice only the conversation. Others absorb the entire atmosphere, the tension between 2 people, the mood behind someone's words, the subtle feeling that something isn't being said. And if you're one of those people, social gatherings require far more energy than they appear to from the outside. Which leads to an important question. If your mind is constantly processing more than most people realize, what happens when that process continues for hours inside the very place where you're supposed to recover? The answer explains far more than just your feelings about guests. And here's something even more interesting. Most people assume that exhaustion comes from doing too much. Too much work, too much responsibility, too much pressure. But mental exhaustion often comes from something else entirely. Too much input, too much information entering the mind without a chance to settle. Imagine leaving 20 browser tabs open at the same time. Each one consumes only a small amount of memory, but together they slow everything down. The human mind works in a surprisingly similar way. Every conversation, every emotional signal, every social expectation, every unspoken tension in the room, your brain keeps processing all of it, even when you're not consciously paying attention. And the more sensitive your nervous system is, the more resources this process requires. That is why some people feel relieved when the guests leave. Not because the guests were unpleasant, not because anything went wrong, but because the flow of incoming information finally stops. For the first time in hours, the mind can become quiet again. And when you understand this, something important changes. You stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" And you start asking a much better question. What kind of environment allows my mind to function at its best? But there is another layer to this that most people never consider. Your home is not only a place where you rest. For some people, it becomes part of the way they think. That might sound strange at first, but pay attention. Have you ever noticed how easily your thoughts flow in a familiar environment? The same chair, the same desk, the same arrangement of objects around you. Your mind becomes accustomed to that order, not because you're obsessed with cleanliness, not because you need everything to be perfect, but because familiar surroundings reduce mental friction. They allow your attention to focus on what truly matters. And then someone visits. A chair gets moved, something is left in a different place. The rhythm of the house changes. To most people, these details seem insignificant. They barely notice them. But for a mind that relies on environmental stability, those small changes create noise, not physical noise, cognitive noise, a subtle feeling that something is different, something is out of alignment. And while others continue relaxing without effort, your brain is already spending energy adapting to a new environment. The surprising part is that most people who experience this never realize it's happening. They simply feel drained and assume something is wrong with them. But what if nothing is wrong at all? And this is where many people make a mistake. They spend years trying to become more social, more available, more accommodating, not because they truly want to, but because they've been told that this is what healthy people do. So they ignore the signals. They say yes when they want to say no. They agree to visits when they desperately need solitude. They convince themselves that everyone else seems fine, so they should be fine too. But the human mind doesn't work that way. Ignoring your natural wiring doesn't make it disappear. It simply forces the nervous system to pay the price later, and the cost is often invisible at first. It doesn't begin with burnout. It begins with subtle things: a little less focus, a little less patience, a little less enthusiasm for things you normally enjoy. You find it harder to concentrate, harder to think deeply, harder to access the creative and reflective parts of yourself. And because the change happens gradually, most people never connect it to the constant pressure of social overstimulation. They assume they're becoming lazy, unmotivated, less disciplined. But sometimes the problem isn't a lack of discipline at all. Sometimes the mind is simply overloaded. Think about a battery. Even the best battery eventually needs recharging. No one considers that a flaw. No one looks at a phone with 10% battery and says, "Why aren't you performing at 100%? The need for recovery is built into the design. Human beings are no different, yet many people spend years fighting against their own design, especially those who naturally process the world more deeply than average. And here's the irony: the same traits that make social situations exhausting are often the very traits that allow someone to think deeply, solve complex problems, notice subtle patterns, and understand people on a level that others miss entirely. The sensitivity that drains you can also become a strength. The need for solitude that others misunderstand can become the foundation for creativity, wisdom, and self-awareness, but only if you stop treating it like a defect. And that leads to perhaps the most important realization of all. Maybe the goal was never to become more like everyone else. Maybe the goal was to understand how your own mind actually works, and build a life around that understanding. There is another misunderstanding that deserves attention. People often assume that being selective with your energy means you don't like people, but those are not the same thing. In fact, some of the people who need the most solitude are the very people who care most deeply about others. The difference is that they don't seek constant interaction. They seek meaningful interaction, and those are two completely different things. Think about the conversations that stay with you for years, the ones you still remember long after they ended, the moments when someone shared something real, a fear, a dream, a painful truth, a perspective that changed the way you see the world. Those conversations rarely happen in noise. They rarely happen when 10 people are competing for attention. They happen when two minds meet without pretending, without performing, without following a script. For some people, that kind of connection is worth more than 100 casual interactions, and because of that, superficial social rituals can feel strangely empty, not unpleasant, just empty. Imagine being hungry and being offered food that looks beautiful but contains no nutrition. You can eat it, you can even enjoy parts of it, but afterward, you're still hungry. Many people experience social life in exactly the same way. Lots of interaction, very little connection, lots of conversation, very little understanding. And over time, the mind begins to recognize the difference. It starts craving depth instead of quantity, meaning instead of activity, authenticity instead of performance. That doesn't make someone arrogant. It doesn't mean they think they're better than anyone else. It simply means their nervous system responds differently to different kinds of experiences. And once you understand that, something begins to shift. You stop measuring the quality of your life by how many people surround you. You start measuring it by how genuine your connections are. Because a single meaningful conversation can leave you energized for days, while an entire evening of small talk can leave you feeling completely exhausted. And perhaps that is the real question, not whether you enjoy being around people, but what kind of human connection actually brings your mind to life. And perhaps this is where the conversation becomes truly important, because understanding yourself is only the first step. The second step is giving yourself permission to stop fighting who you are. Many people spend years trying to become a different person, a louder person, a more social person, a person who never needs time alone, a person who can move from one conversation to another without feeling drained. But imagine asking a tree to grow like a river, or asking a river to stand still like a mountain. The problem is not that one is better than the other. The problem is expecting something to become what it was never designed to be. Human beings make this mistake constantly. We compare ourselves to people whose minds work differently. We look at someone who gains energy from crowds and wonder why we cannot do the same. We see someone who thrives in constant activity and assume there must be something missing in us. But comparison is often ignorance wearing the mask of self-improvement. Because you are comparing different systems, different temperaments, different nervous systems, different ways of experiencing reality. And when you stop comparing, something unexpected happens. You begin noticing the advantages of your own nature. You notice how deeply you can focus when the world becomes quiet. You notice how much others trust you because you genuinely listen. You notice patterns that people overlook. You notice emotions that remain invisible to most. You begin seeing that what once felt like a burden is often connected to your greatest strengths, the ability to think deeply, the ability to reflect, the ability to understand complexity, the ability to remain thoughtful in a world that constantly pushes people toward distraction. And perhaps that is why solitude feels different to you. For some people, being alone feels like absence. For others, it feels like space. Space to think, space to create, space to reconnect with themselves, space to hear thoughts that are drowned out by constant noise. And maybe the goal was never to eliminate that need. Maybe the goal was to respect it, because the people who understand their own nature are not the ones who withdraw from life. They are the ones who engage with it wisely, choosing where to invest their energy, choosing who receives their attention, and protecting the mental resources that make them who they are. And when everything is said and done, one truth remains. The way you experience the world is not a mistake. It is not a flaw that needs to be corrected. It is not evidence that something is missing from your character. For far too long, people have been taught to judge themselves through the expectations of others. If everyone enjoys something, you should enjoy it too. If everyone wants more social interaction, you should want it too. If everyone feels energized by constant activity, you should learn to do the same. But reality is far more complex than that. Human beings are different not only in appearance, talent, or personality. They are different in the way they process life itself. Some minds are built for stimulation, others are built for depth. Some are energized by movement, others are energized by reflection. Neither is superior, both have value. The problem begins when a person spends years rejecting their own nature in an attempt to imitate someone else's, because no amount of imitation can create lasting peace. Peace comes from understanding, from recognizing what strengthens you and what depletes you, from knowing when to open the door and when to protect your space, from understanding that boundaries are not walls, They are filters. They allow the right experiences to enter while keeping unnecessary noise out. And perhaps that is the lesson hidden beneath everything we've discussed today. You do not need fewer people in your life. You need the right people. You do not need endless conversation. You need meaningful conversation. You do not need to force yourself into every social situation that appears. You need the freedom to choose intentionally, because the quality of your life is rarely determined by how much stimulation surrounds you. It is determined by whether your environment supports the person you truly are. And maybe the next time someone says, "We're coming over on Friday," you won't immediately judge your reaction. You won't assume that something is wrong with you. Instead, you'll understand what your mind is trying to tell you. You'll recognize the need for balance, the need for recovery, the need for genuine connection. And most importantly, you'll stop seeing your nature as a problem to solve and start seeing it as something to understand. Because self-awareness is not about becoming someone else. It's about finally understanding who you've been all along.